A pilot thought it was funny to glue a black child's hand to a tray table mid-flight. He laughed, hurled slurs, and mocked him until federal agents met him at the gate. What happens next will leave you speechless. He laughed while that child cried, thinking no one would hold him accountable. But justice boarded the same flight. If you stand for consequences, not cruelty, hit subscribe today. The moment Boyd Rennick stepped into the cabin, the mood shifted. His polished black shoes clicked against the narrow aisle floor, but it wasn't the sound that drew attention. It was the expression on his face. Cold, judgmental, and deliberate. He wasn't supposed to be out here. Senior pilots rarely mingled with passengers once the pre-flight checks were complete. Yet here he was, walking past the rows of passengers like a man inspecting a crowd he didn't trust. Malik Harper felt the eyes before he saw them. He had just finished adjusting the plastic seatbelt across his waist in seat 8C near the front of the plane when he noticed a shadow loom in the corner of his vision. He looked up, his fingers still resting on the worn strap of his backpack tucked beside him. That was when he saw the pilot, the man in crisp Navy uniform, wings on his chest, and a sneer barely hidden beneath a forced smile. Boyd's eyes narrowed as he passed. He didn't slow down, didn't speak, but the look was unmistakable. Disgust mixed with mockery, like Malik was something out of place, something unwelcome. Malik blinked, unsure how to process it. He had been on his best behavior. His dad had gone over every detail back home in Lindenport, where to check in, how to find his seat, when to speak, and when to stay quiet. "Just be polite and stay in your seat," his father, David Harper, had said, crouching beside him at the terminal gate with that mix of warmth and quiet seriousness that only fathers carried. Malik had nodded, memorizing the instructions like a school lesson. He was only 11, but he understood the importance of not drawing attention, especially when flying alone. So he kept his head down, shoulders still, and quietly reached into his backpack for his sketch pad. He didn't want snacks or games like the other kids. He just wanted to draw. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, but already Malik felt something off. He couldn't explain it, not clearly, just a tightness in the air, the way some of the flight crew exchanged looks after the pilot passed, the awkward silence that followed him. No one said anything directly, but the whispers that trailed him said more than words could. In the front galley, one of the attendants leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "He's in a mood again." Another added softly, "Maybe he saw something he didn't like." A third glanced toward Malik's row but quickly turned away when the pilot reappeared. Malik didn't hear any of this. His focus was on the half-finished sketch of a robot he had started that morning. Pencil in hand, he shaded the outline of an arm, then paused to glance out the window at the hazy clouds forming along the horizon. The world felt peaceful in that moment, small and quiet, just the way he liked it. But peace wasn't what Boyd Rennick had in mind. Back in the cockpit, Boyd adjusted his headset, flipping switches with controlled aggression. His co-pilot, a junior named Eric Landon, offered him a quick weather update and received only a grunt in response. "You good, Captain?" Eric asked hesitantly. Boyd didn't look at him. He stared straight ahead, voice flat. "Some kids don't know where they belong." Eric said nothing more. He had been warned not to challenge Boyd's moods. There had been stories, things that weren't in writing, just muttered tales from other crew members about jokes that went too far, passengers who left flights in tears, and complaints that never seemed to reach HR. But Boyd always found a way to twist the narrative. He knew how to look official, and, more importantly, he knew who to talk to when someone needed silencing. Still, it was rare for him to fixate on a single passenger before takeoff. Something about the boy in 8C had stirred something in him, a quietness that rubbed him the wrong way. The way Malik sat so neatly, so still, like he belonged there, like he deserved it. Boyd hated that. Malik, meanwhile, kept his eyes on his sketch pad, but his ears caught pieces of conversation now. A couple across the aisle was laughing softly. A man behind him rustled a newspaper. Everything felt normal, or tried to. The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the engines hummed to life. The plane was ready for taxi. A soft chime indicated the beginning of the safety demonstration, and Malik looked up, listening politely as the attendants pointed to exits and oxygen masks. He already knew most of it. He had practiced everything with his dad. Still, something gnawed at him. That pilot's face, the way he looked at him. He shook it off, telling himself not to worry. He was just a kid on a plane, doing everything right. But Boyd wasn't the kind of man who waited for someone to misstep. He created the misstep. The game had already begun, and Malik didn't even know he'd been drafted into it. The plane began rolling toward the runway, engines building in pitch. Malik glanced out the window, then down at his sketch again. He shaded a corner, then wrote a name beside the figure. Protector. His latest character. A guardian made of steel and light. Someone who stood between people and danger. If only he had one now. In the cockpit, Boyd reached for the intercom switch but hesitated. His eyes flicked to the passenger list on the side panel. Row 8C. Unaccompanied minor. Name, Malik Harper. His mouth curled into a crooked smirk. He tapped the switch with a firm press. "Cabin secure," he said dryly. "Wheels up in 5. The engines roared, pressing Malik gently into his seat as the plane lifted off. He gripped the armrest not out of fear but with anticipation. The clouds outside blurred into white streaks, and for a moment he felt like he was flying with them. Free. He didn't know yet that the man flying the plane had already marked him. He was just a boy on a plane, but someone had already chosen to make him a target. "Having fun up here in first class?" The words landed like a rock in Malik Harper's chest. He looked up from his sketch pad, startled as the tall figure of the captain loomed above him. Boyd Rennick's voice was loud, almost cheerful on the surface, but his eyes told a different story. Cold, inspecting, hungry for discomfort. The captain's sudden appearance in the cabin had already caused murmurs among the nearby passengers. After all, it wasn't standard for a pilot to walk the aisle mid-flight, especially not to personally address a child traveling alone. Malik blinked, unsure of how to respond. He gave a small, polite nod, clutching his pencil tighter, the tip pressing into the paper. His drawing, a superhero leaping between buildings, blurred in his mind as anxiety crept in. Boyd's smile curled tighter, his expression shifting from curiosity to condescension. "Well then," the captain continued, reaching into his flight coat pocket with deliberate slowness, "let's make sure you don't float away." Malik tilted his head slightly, confused. Before he could ask what that meant, Boyd withdrew a small gray tube, industrial adhesive. Thick, metallic, and clearly not something meant for use midair. Malik barely had time to open his mouth when Boyd uncapped the tube and squeezed a sticky line across the boy's right palm. The glue oozed cold and tacky over Malik's skin. He gasped, trying to pull his hand back, but Boyd was faster. With a firm push, he slammed Malik's palm onto the plastic tray table and held it there, his grip strong and unrelenting. The table rattled slightly under the force. Malik squirmed, trying to yank his hand free, but it was too late. The adhesive was already bonding. "Stop! What are you?" Malik's voice cracked, too soft for the cabin noise, too unsure to cause alarm. Some passengers glanced over, their faces showing various shades of amusement and confusion. A few even chuckled, assuming it was some kind of joke, a quirky pilot's playful prank. One man across the aisle lifted his phone halfway, then hesitated. Malik looked around frantically, silently pleading for someone to notice what was really happening. "It's just a joke," Boyd said with a grin, lifting his hands in mock innocence for the others to see. But his tone dropped as he leaned closer to Malik's ear. "Spoiled brats like you think the world owes you everything." Malik froze. The words stung more than the glue now searing against his skin. The heat in Boyd's breath, the venom in his whisper. It pierced deeper than the pain in his hand. Boyd gave one last pat on the tray table as if sealing the job, then straightened up and turned away without another word. His boots thudded against the carpet as he strode back down the aisle toward the cockpit, not bothering to look back. Malik sat motionless, his heart thudding in his ears. The sticky sensation had turned into a burning itch, then into sharp pain. His fingers twitched, trying to lift, but the tray held them down like a trap. The edges of the glue tugged at his skin each time he moved. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it hurt. He looked at the seatbelt sign above him. Still on, still flying, no help in sight. Kyle, the young flight attendant who had given him water earlier, passed by from the rear with a smile that faded the moment he saw Malik's hand stuck to the tray. He slowed, concern creeping into his eyes. He opened his mouth, but Boyd's voice crackled over the intercom at that exact moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we continue our smooth journey to Caraway. Everything is under control." The calm tone of authority masked the cruelty that had just taken place. Malik looked down, biting his lip as the pain in his palm grew worse. The tray table showed faint smudges where the glue had spread beyond his hand, tightening like a bandage. He blinked back tears, determined not to cry in front of strangers. His father had told him to stay composed. If something ever feels wrong, stay calm. Think smart. So Malik began thinking. He noted the seat number printed above the row. He remembered Boyd's name, stitched neatly on the lapel. He tried to recall the time, how long it had been since takeoff. With his free hand, he flipped his sketchpad closed and pressed it tightly to his lap, shielding it. This was no longer just a flight. It was a moment he needed to remember in detail. From behind him, a low voice muttered, "What was that all about?" Another man whispered, "Did he really glue the kid's hand?" The laughter had faded. Unease had crept in. Malik stared ahead, face pale but focused. The pain throbbed with every heartbeat, but he refused to cry. He was 11, yes, but he wasn't helpless. He was watching. He was remembering. Up in the cockpit, Boyd chuckled to himself and reclined in his seat, confident that the cabin had already moved on. To him, it had been a harmless joke, maybe even a lesson, something to make himself feel in control. But back in seat 8C, a boy sat still, his hand bound by force, his dignity bruised, but his mind sharper than ever. The other passengers might not have understood what they had just witnessed, but Malik knew. He knew cruelty when it wore a smile, and he knew that someday someone would ask what happened and he would be ready. The glue held tight, but the hate behind it clung even harder. Malik's eyes widened as his palm burned against the cold plastic. The glue had spread faster than he expected, and now his right hand was completely fixed to the tray table. Panic started to rise in his chest, but he pushed it down, just like his father had taught him. Don't panic, don't shout. Stay calm and think smart. But the pain, it felt like his skin was being tugged from the bone every time he so much as flexed a finger. He tried to pull back gently, hoping the adhesive hadn't fully cured, but the resistance was brutal. The tray didn't move. His skin didn't move. His hand wasn't going anywhere. Captain Boyd Rennick loomed beside him for a moment longer, the mocking grin still painted across his face. He leaned down just close enough for no one else to hear and hissed, "Where are your manners? Didn't your kind learn discipline?" His breath was stale and hot. His tone, quiet but seething, landed sharper than the sting of the glue itself. Malik froze. He wanted to pull away, to scream, to shove the man away from him, but his hand held him hostage, and his voice caught somewhere in the back of his throat. Across the aisle, a few passengers had glanced up when Boyd first approached, expecting a light-hearted interaction between pilot and passenger, but now that Boyd had returned to the cockpit, chuckling under his breath, most looked away, assuming the moment had passed. A few passengers whispered. Some glanced at Malik, who sat perfectly still, tears now brimming at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them away furiously. He wouldn't cry. Not here, not in front of strangers, not for him. Kyle, the young flight attendant, stood a few rows away with the service cart paused mid-aisle. He'd seen everything. His eyes, wide and uneasy, flicked from the cockpit door to Malik. Slowly, he approached, leaning in just enough to whisper, "Are you okay?" His voice was shaky, his gaze unsure. Malik hesitated before nodding slightly, not because he was okay, but because he didn't want to cause more trouble. Kyle straightened up, clearly unsettled. That wasn't funny," he murmured under his breath, mostly to himself. He took one last glance toward the cockpit, then stepped back toward the galley, unsure of what to do. The tray table beneath Malik's hand was slick with a sheen of sweat now, but it still wouldn't give. His fingers tingled, and the discomfort had turned into real pain. It was a throbbing, rhythmic burn that grew stronger with each passing second. He clenched his jaw and turned slightly to his left, hoping someone, anyone, might notice. But the man next to him was asleep, his head bobbing to one side, oblivious. The woman across the aisle was flipping through a magazine, headphones in. No one was watching, except one. 2 rows back, a man with salt and pepper hair, wearing a brown jacket and dark-rimmed glasses, had his phone tilted just enough to capture the row ahead. He didn't speak. He didn't move, but his thumb gently tapped the side of the phone, clearly recording. Malik caught his eye for a fleeting second. The man nodded slightly, reassuring, silent. It wasn't much, but it was something. Inside, Malik's mind raced. He started scanning the row numbers. Seat 10, A, Seat 7, D. A small stain on the seatback pocket, a scuff mark on the tray next to him. The buttons on the overhead panel were labeled in faint, worn lettering. He took it all in. Details, evidence. His dad always said, if something goes wrong, remember everything. Malik didn't know why a pilot would do something like this to a kid, but he knew one thing. It wasn't just a joke, not when it hurt like this. Not when the words whispered to him weren't funny, they were cruel. He winced again as he tried to shift his fingers. The glue was definitely industrial. He'd seen it in his uncle's garage once, the kind that bonds fast and strong. He wouldn't be peeling out of this without a fight. The longer it sat, the deeper it fused. Already the skin beneath his palm was raw and pinched, and a small bubble had formed near the edge of his thumb. He bit the inside of his cheek and counted to 5, trying to steady his breathing. Time dragged. The hum of the plane seemed louder now. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. The man in the brown jacket adjusted in his seat, then resumed filming. The passengers remained caught in an eerie in-between, some aware, most indifferent, all unsure. Was this a prank? A performance? No one wanted to be the first to stand up. No one wanted to assume the worst. That was the cruel magic of it all. Boyd had wrapped his hate in the clothing of humor, letting silence do the rest. Malik didn't scream. He didn't beg. But deep down, fear mixed with something else. Anger, not loud or explosive, but steady, solid. He kept his eyes on the cockpit door, as if memorizing the frame. He took in the faces of the crew, the way Kyle's hands trembled as he poured drinks. He noted the glances that darted away when they landed on him. He noted everything. His sketch pad sat in his lap, unopened. His favorite pencil had rolled down to the floor. He couldn't reach it. His left hand was free, but his right remained pinned. He stared at it, at the glue that now bound him to the plastic, and made a quiet vow. They won't forget this. Whatever this was, it wouldn't stay hidden. The pain surged again, sharper now. He exhaled slowly through his nose. In the distance, the captain's voice crackled faintly over the cockpit radio as he chatted with the control tower, calm, relaxed, as if nothing had happened. Malik shut his eyes for a moment, then opened them slowly. He wouldn't give Boyd the satisfaction of seeing him break. He didn't know how long the flight had left. He didn't know what the man in the brown jacket would do with the footage. He didn't know if Kyle would grow a spine and report what happened. But he did know that this wasn't just some moment to forget. He knew what it was. Even glued in place, Malik was already planning his escape. 30 minutes had passed since Malik Harper's hand had been forced onto the tray table and glued there by the pilot, and the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from light murmurs to an uneasy buzz of discomfort. The boy sat rigid in seat 8C, his right hand blistered and stuck fast to the table in front of him. His fingers had started to swell, the skin tight and red. The glue had dried fully, a crusted amber seal pressing into his palm like a brand. He fought the urge to cry, his father's voice echoing in his head. Stay calm. Think smart. Kyle, the young flight attendant who had been cheerful earlier in the flight, now hovered beside Malik with a worried look plastered across his face. He bent down slowly, speaking in a voice barely louder than a whisper. I brought tissues. I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was going to do that. Malik didn't answer. He kept his eyes down, biting the inside of his cheek to stay composed. The boy's breathing had become shallow, and there was a faint tremble in his legs beneath the tray. His left hand clenched tightly around the edge of his seat. Kyle, eyes darting nervously toward the cockpit, knelt beside him and hesitated before pulling a disposable plastic utensil from his pocket. Maybe I can lift it, he said, trying to wedge it gently between Malik's hand and the plastic surface. The boy flinched as pain shot up his arm. Stop, he whispered. It's ripping. Kyle withdrew his hand instantly. I'm sorry, he stammered again, rising to his feet, his face pale. Suddenly, the intercom clicked on, and the sharp bark of Captain Boyd Rennick's voice echoed through the cabin. Sit tight, folks. Just a bit of fun with our young flyer up front, he said with theatrical cheer, as if narrating a comedy sketch. Some passengers chuckled awkwardly, unsure if they were part of a joke or witnessing something serious. Others began to shift in their seats, glancing toward the front. That was when Mr. Darvin stood up. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark gray business suit, the man in seat 10A turned to face the aisle, his face tense with restrained anger. He spoke in a firm, unwavering tone. What exactly is going on up here? That boy is hurt. Someone needs to help him now. His voice cut through the cabin noise like a blade. Heads turned. Passengers who had previously looked away were now watching closely. Tension thickened. From the cockpit, Boyd's voice returned, harsher this time. "Sir, you are interfering with crew procedures. Sit down immediately or you'll be escorted off this plane upon landing." Darvin didn't move. He took a step closer to Malik's row, his gaze narrowing. "You glued a child's hand down, and you call that a procedure?" There was a pause, long enough for discomfort to settle into the bones of everyone listening. Kyle stood frozen between them, caught in the middle. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. No one moved for a moment. Then faint murmurs began to swell among the passengers like the low rumble before a storm. Whispers passed row to row. Some men pulled out their phones, pretending to check messages while angling the cameras discreetly toward the front of the cabin. Others leaned toward their seatmates, their expressions uncertain, wary. The mood had shifted entirely. Boyd's authority no longer felt invincible. Meanwhile, Malik's vision blurred slightly as the pain intensified. His lips were dry, and he felt heat rising in his cheeks. The dizziness crept in waves, but he kept breathing steadily, trying to count quietly in his head. 1, 2, 3. Think. He couldn't cry now, not in front of everyone. He couldn't give Boyd the satisfaction. Still unnoticed at the very rear of the plane, seat 28C, a man in a gray hoodie lifted his eyes from a worn paperback and calmly took in the scene unfolding ahead. He was motionless at first, watching the way the passengers leaned, how Boyd's voice echoed with increasing defensiveness, how Kyle's body language shrank more with every second. This man had flown under countless identities across dozens of flights, and what he was seeing now finally matched the reports that had come across his desk for months, reports that had always felt off but never had solid evidence. The man in the hoodie slowly reached down to the inside pocket of his carry-on, removing a small encrypted device no larger than a phone. With practiced fingers, he tapped a series of inputs, sending a silent alert to a nearby field station at Caraway Regional Airport. His thumb hovered for half a second, then pressed confirm. His name was Marcus Vell, a senior field agent with the Federal Transit Protection Authority, and what he had just witnessed was no longer just misconduct. It was abuse, deliberate, targeted, and cruel. He shifted in his seat, scanning the cabin again. Boyd had emerged briefly from the cockpit, shouting down the aisle, "If any of you want to spend your weekend talking to federal investigators, go ahead and keep playing heroes. Otherwise, sit down and let the crew do its job." That was it. Marcus slid the secure device back into his bag and rose to his feet. He didn't make a sound, but he wasn't sitting anymore. He began walking up the aisle slowly, deliberately, passing row after row. Some passengers looked up, sensing something in his quiet presence. Malik, eyes wide with pain and confusion, caught a glimpse of the man's steady gaze. There was something calm about him, something solid. And though Marcus said nothing yet, Boyd caught the motion out of the corner of his eye and paused. There was something in the way the man walked, not hurried, not aggressive, but purposeful, like someone who didn't need permission to act. Kyle stepped back as Marcus neared, giving him space without a word. Boyd stood his ground, though he stiffened noticeably. Malik looked up, the cabin spinning slightly, but his eyes locked with Marcus's. For the first time since the flight began, the boy didn't feel alone. The flight was no longer just a route, it was evidence. The silence in the cabin had grown dense, thick like a storm just before the thunder breaks. Malik's hand remained glued to the tray table, his fingers blistering beneath the pressure, his breath coming in shallow waves. He kept his head down, not because he was weak, but because he remembered his father's words. Stay calm. Think smart. Across the aisle, most passengers averted their eyes, caught between disbelief and discomfort, unsure whether what they had just witnessed was real or some grotesque performance. But in seat 32F, at the very back of the aircraft, Marcus Vell didn't hesitate. Without shifting in his seat, Marcus slowly unzipped the side pocket of his carry-on and reached for a small matte black device that looked like a portable charger. It wasn't. He pressed his thumb to the biometric pad, and within seconds, a silent encrypted signal was dispatched to a secure channel monitored by the Federal Transit Protection Authority. Simultaneously, a second message was relayed to an agent stationed at Caraway Regional Airport. Immediate extraction protocol. Witness on board. Prepare medical and security response. Confirm Boyd Rennick as a subject. His training surged to the forefront, instinct locking in over emotion, but only just. Behind his composed expression, Marcus was burning with controlled rage. This wasn't just procedural misconduct. It wasn't a breach of professionalism. This was a deliberate, humiliating act of cruelty aimed at a child. A black child. And it matched the exact pattern of incidents he'd flagged in his earlier reports that had been marked inconclusive by higher-ups unwilling to take on a commercial airline without solid proof. Now they had it. Still in his seat, Marcus adjusted his hoodie subtly, surveying the cabin. Malik sat frozen in 8 degrees Celsius, tears threatening to fall, his right hand still pinned painfully to the tray. Every time he twitched, the adhesive pulled at raw skin. The faint scent of industrial glue lingered in the air, acrid, sharp, and suffocating. Kyle, the young trainee attendant, hovered nearby with guilt written across his face. His hands trembled as he clutched a paper cup filled with warm water. I think this might help," Kyle whispered, glancing nervously toward the cockpit. Malik didn't answer, but his eyes flicked up with desperate hope. Kyle knelt beside him and began to pour the water gently along the edge of the tray where glue met skin. For a brief moment, the bond softened, but then came the sting. Malik gasped as layers of skin peeled with the tacky glue. A thin line of blood trickled from the edge of his palm, and he bit his lip to keep from crying out. From a few rows back, Darvin, the man in the business suit from seat 10A, rose to his feet again. "This is enough," he said, voice low but firm. "He's hurt. We can all see it." Several heads nodded. Passengers had started whispering now, trading glances, clutching their phones. The quiet horror had begun to shift. The unease was turning to unrest. Suddenly, the cockpit door swung open with a loud metallic click. Boyd Rennick stormed into the aisle like he owned the sky. "What's going on here?" he barked, his eyes darting straight to Kyle. "Did I tell you to do anything with that boy?" Kyle stood slowly, shielding Malik with his body. "Captain, you need to follow orders," Boyd snapped, his voice sharp with authority and condescension. "This isn't a daycare. This is my aircraft. Sit down." Darvin stepped forward, blocking Boyd's view of Malik. "He's a kid. He's bleeding." Boyd's lip curled. "And you're about to be removed from this flight for insubordination." That's when Marcus stood. He didn't rush. He didn't yell. He simply rose from the last row, calm and composed, and began walking down the aisle. His steps were slow but certain, the kind that made people take notice without understanding why. Passengers instinctively leaned back as he passed, sensing a shift in power without needing to be told. Boyd turned, frowning at the tall man in the gray hoodie approaching him. "Sir, return to your seat. This is a secure—" Marcus said nothing. He kept walking. Boyd raised his hand as if to physically block him. "I'm warning you." Marcus stopped just short of Boyd's reach and slowly pulled back the edge of his hoodie. A silver badge glinted from a black neck pouch, its seal unmistakable. Federal Transit Protection Authority. "Marcus Vell," he said evenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You don't give me orders, Captain." For the first time, Boyd faltered. Kyle took a shaky breath. A wave of gasps passed through the cabin. Passengers who had once been silent now leaned forward, their eyes wide. Phones were no longer hidden, but lifted, recording everything. The energy had changed. The sky had changed. Boyd's mouth opened, searching for words. This is a misunderstanding." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "This is assault. You glued a child's hand to a tray and made racially charged remarks while piloting a commercial aircraft. That's not a prank. That's a federal crime." Boyd stepped back. I didn't mean—" "I don't care what you meant," Marcus said, his tone like cold steel. "I care what you did." Behind them, Malik lifted his head, his face still strained with pain, but something new had entered his expression. Relief. Hope. He locked eyes with the man standing tall in front of the captain, the man who had changed everything without raising his voice. Marcus crouched beside the boy, his expression softening. "You're safe now, Malik," he said, gently placing his coat over the boy's shoulders. "I've got you." And for the first time in nearly an hour, the cabin felt safe. Kyle wiped his face. Darvin nodded silently. Someone in the back started to clap, and slowly others joined. The fear was gone. Boyd stood frozen, humiliated and defeated, surrounded not by clouds, but by consequences. The boy wasn't alone anymore, and the man standing now didn't need a uniform to command respect. "Sit down, sir. This is a secured area. I'm the captain of this plane." Boyd's voice cut through the cabin like a snapped wire, sharp, defensive, laced with an authority he was quickly losing grip over. He stood tall at the front of the aisle, his uniform still crisp, but the confidence behind it faltering. His narrowed eyes settled on the man now standing just beyond row 8. The smirk he had worn earlier had faded, replaced by a guarded sneer, as if he still hoped intimidation could control the moment. But Marcus Vell didn't move. Instead, in one calm motion, he reached up to his neck and pulled back the hood of his sweatshirt, revealing a dark lanyard that had been tucked neatly beneath the collar. A badge, metallic and unmistakable, glinted in the cabin's soft overhead lights. He held it up without a word at first, letting the passengers see it before he spoke. "Marcus Vell," he said firmly, "Federal Transit Protection Authority." The air changed instantly. A collective gasp spread from seat to seat like a ripple across still water. Passengers craned their necks. A child in row 12 pointed and whispered. Even Kyle, the nervous young attendant, backed away a step, his hands fluttering toward the service cart like it could shield him from the moment. For the first time all flight, Boyd blinked in real confusion. His lips parted, but no words came out. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered finally, his voice losing its edge. "I was only joking around." Marcus took a step forward, slow and deliberate, each footfall echoing louder than it should have. His posture was unshaken, his voice level and clear. "No, it's an abuse of power. You glued a child's hand to a tray and made racial remarks while flying a commercial aircraft. That's not a prank, that's assault under federal transport law." Boyd's face drained of color. At seat 8C, Malik remained silent, his small body hunched forward, his right hand still stuck to the tray table, red and blistered. His eyes, wide and glassy from pain and confusion, flicked between Boyd and Marcus. The boy didn't fully understand the titles or the laws being named, but he understood tone. He understood safety. And something in Marcus's voice made him feel, for the first time since boarding, that someone was truly on his side. Marcus's gaze softened when it turned to the boy. He crouched slowly beside him, his body shielding Malik from the rest of the cabin. The movement was gentle, precise, like approaching a wounded animal that had been cornered too long. "You're safe now, Malik," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've got you." Malik didn't speak. He didn't need to. His left hand, the one not glued down, trembled slightly, hovering above his lap. Marcus noticed and gave him a quiet nod of reassurance. Behind them, murmurs turned to soft claps. A few passengers applauded, more out of relief than celebration. They had witnessed something they couldn't undo, and for too long many had remained frozen, unsure of what to do. But now, the moment had clarity. Someone had drawn a line. Boyd took a shaky step backward, bumping into the side of the galley wall. His hands went to his hips instinctively as though reaching for authority he no longer possessed. "I'm the captain of this flight," he said again, but the statement sounded weak, hollow. "No," Marcus replied, rising slowly to his feet, positioning himself between Boyd and the passengers. "You were. Now you answer to the law." Kyle stood by, pale and silent, the reality dawning on him. He clutched the edge of the service cart as if steadying his conscience. Passengers watched him too, wondering if he'd speak, but he didn't, not yet. His guilt was written across his face. Marcus turned to the passengers and spoke clearly. "Everything that happened here, if you recorded it, if you heard what was said, please stay calm. When we land, you'll be asked to share what you saw. That boy deserves justice, and your words can help." Heads nodded across the cabin. The engine hum was the only background sound now, a quiet roar that underscored the tension. Boyd lingered near the cockpit entrance, uncertain whether to retreat or fight back. His fingers twitched near the intercom switch as if planning one last attempt to regain control. But the weight of the badge in Marcus's hand, and the eyes of the entire cabin, held him in place. Malik shifted in his seat, letting out a shallow breath. His lips were dry, his cheeks still stained with tears, but there was something new in his expression, a flicker of strength returning. The plane hadn't changed course, but everything inside it had. Boyd Rennick, who believed the sky answered to him, now stood beneath someone else's jurisdiction. The walls he'd built with intimidation and arrogance were crumbling, inch by inch, under the quiet authority of a man who had chosen to stand up. The man who flew the plane thought he ruled the skies, but now he faced someone who answered to a higher law. Marcus Vell didn't waste a second. As the seatbelt sign blinked on for descent, he turned sharply to Kyle, the young flight attendant whose hands were still shaking. "I need you to move now," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "Start gathering anyone who heard the pilot's remarks or recorded what happened. Seat numbers, names, devices, everything." Kyle nodded, his eyes darting to the cockpit where Boyd Rennick remained sealed inside. He hadn't spoken a word since Marcus's declaration, but his heavy breathing was still audible over the intercom system. For the first time in his career, Kyle didn't feel loyalty to the crew, only to the truth. He turned and moved quickly down the aisle, gently whispering to passengers, accepting phones, noting seat assignments. Some handed over footage with quiet determination, others with reluctant awe. A few still looked stunned, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Inside the cockpit, Boyd gripped the radio like a lifeline. His voice, clipped and tight, barely concealed his panic. "Caraway Tower, this is NV Flight 312, requesting immediate priority landing, onboard disturbance, request secure gate on arrival." The response came calmly through the static. "Copy that, NV 312. Agents are standing by. Proceed to Gate 5, you are cleared for descent." Boyd didn't reply. He stared out the windshield, knuckles white on the controls. For all his bluster and authority, his mind was racing. What had just happened? How had one quiet boy and a hidden badge unraveled everything? Meanwhile, Malik sat slumped in his seat, his hand finally freed from the tray table but still raw and swollen. His skin was blistered, shiny with ointment Kyle had found in the emergency kit. A soft compress rested on top, secured loosely with gauze. Every movement sent sharp stings through his fingers, but he stayed silent, holding Marcus's borrowed jacket around his shoulders like a shield. Marcus knelt beside him again, his tone calm but direct. "We're almost there," he said. "Once we land, medics will come in and help. You'll be taken to the hospital. Your father will meet you there." Malik blinked slowly, his voice hoarse. "Will the pilot go to jail?" Marcus paused. "He'll answer for what he did," he said carefully. "That I promise." The plane banked slightly, engines humming as the runway neared. Around them, the passengers had gone from silent observers to quiet allies. Some watched Malik with concerned eyes. Others looked toward the cockpit with contempt. The atmosphere was no longer confused. It was charged, coiled with something new. Awareness and anger. Then Boyd's voice crackled faintly through the intercom again, an attempt to reclaim control. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our final descent, please." The speaker clicked off abruptly. Marcus had stepped into the aisle and reached for the cabin intercom. His voice was clear, composed, and undeniable. "This is Agent Marcus Vell with the Federal Transit Protection Authority. Federal authorities will be boarding upon landing. Please remain seated and cooperate with instructions." A ripple spread through the cabin. Gasps. Murmurs. Passengers exchanged glances, some wide-eyed, others nodding. The truth had broken through the routine of flight instructions and empty platitudes. Now everyone understood. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't just an incident. From behind Marcus, Kyle emerged with a handful of passengers in tow, holding phones, writing names. A tall man with a short beard, seat 10A, handed Marcus a phone. "I got the whole thing," he said, "from when the pilot glued his hand down. It's all there." Marcus nodded, accepting it. "Thank you. This will help more than you know." The plane's wheels screeched against the tarmac, the sudden jolt jerking them all slightly forward. Malik winced, but didn't cry out. Marcus placed a hand gently on the back of his seat. "Almost done," he said softly. "Stay with me." As the aircraft slowed and taxied toward the gate, Boyd's voice never returned. He sat rigid in the cockpit, headset off, sweat beading on his brow. The silence behind that locked door was louder than any broadcast. Outside the windows, blue uniforms gathered near the jet bridge. Medical teams rolled a stretcher into position. The tower had gone quiet too, watching from above as one of the most startling mid-air abuses in modern aviation came to a landing. Literally. Boyd made one last attempt to assert control. Over the intercom, his voice returned, brittle and desperate. "Cabin crew, prepare!" Marcus pressed the intercom again, his tone cutting clean through the air like a knife through fabric. "This is Agent Vell. Federal authorities will be boarding. Please remain seated." The command echoed through the cabin, final and absolute. Around him, no one moved. No one resisted. For the first time since takeoff, there was clarity. This was no longer Boyd Rennick's flight. It never had been. Malik turned his head weakly, his face pale but his eyes alert. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The presence of the man beside him said enough. He had been seen, protected, heard. Passengers leaned back in their seats, some closing their eyes, others whispering to neighbors. There were no more questions, only a slow realization that they had been part of something larger than turbulence or inconvenience. Marcus remained standing until the plane came to a full stop, and outside, footsteps rushed forward, heavy and fast. The boy they had once ignored had become the center of a federal investigation. What began as cruelty disguised as humor was now unfolding as one of the most high-profile abuse cases in aviation history. He called it a joke, but the pain was real. If you believe no black child should ever be dehumanized for someone else's entertainment, subscribe now. This story demands to be heard. The aircraft door hissed open with a metallic clunk, and the chaos that had been quietly simmering inside the plane spilled out into action. 2 uniformed federal agents surged forward, followed closely by a team of medics in navy blue jackets marked with emergency symbols. Their boots hit the cabin floor in unison, purposeful and unflinching. Boyd Rennick, still in full captain's uniform, instinctively stepped toward them, hands slightly raised as if to assert control. "You can't do this! I'm the pilot," he barked, voice rising with each word. But his protests bounced off in different faces. One of the agents, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm expression and mirrored sunglasses, didn't even hesitate. He pulled Boyd's arms behind his back, snapping the cuffs on with practiced precision. Boyd thrashed. "This is a mistake. These people don't know what really happened." The agents remained silent. One reached up and turned off the cockpit intercom to prevent any further outbursts. Boyd's voice began to falter, drowned out by the growing presence of law and order now occupying the narrow aisles. His captain's authority had vanished the moment that door opened. On the left side of the cabin, just a few feet ahead of row 8, medics gathered around Malik. The boy sat slumped slightly, his breathing shallow, eyes glazed from pain and exhaustion. A medic carefully inspected his right hand, which was now bandaged but still visibly raw beneath the wraps. Another unfolded a stretcher, while a third spoke gently. "We're going to move you now, okay? Just stay as still as you can." Malik didn't respond at first, his gaze locked on the surrounding movement. The world had become a blur of motion and uniforms. But then, amidst the noise, his eyes found what he was searching for: his father. David Harper sprinted into the cabin, breath tight and face pale with urgency. His shoes barely touched the ground as he reached his son's side, kneeling beside the stretcher before the medics could even lift it. "Malik," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm here now." Malik blinked hard, as if waking from a nightmare. "Dad?" "I'm here now. You did so good," David said again, gripping Malik's uninjured hand with a firm yet trembling hold. His eyes shimmered with tears he refused to let fall. Marcus Vell stood nearby, his posture stiff with focus, eyes scanning every corner of the cabin. He gave David a subtle nod, both as confirmation and solidarity. Then, turning toward the agents who had just secured Boyd, he said firmly, "Secure the black box. Check the cockpit audio. There's enough here to expose what's been buried for years." The command triggered immediate movement. Another agent headed toward the cockpit, brushing past Kyle, the young flight attendant, who stood quietly in the galley, eyes wide, hands clenched at his sides. He looked like someone who had finally realized he'd been part of something much bigger than a mismanaged flight. In the terminal, the ripple of what had happened had already begun to spread. An airport staffer with a security badge whispered into his walkie-talkie, and within minutes, a group of reporters with cameras and microphones surged near the arrival gate, waiting for confirmation. A network van pulled into the curb outside. Word traveled fast. Marcus stepped down the aircraft stairs, jacket zipped up against the wind. A crowd was forming behind the barricades. His boots tapped against the concrete with measured pace as he faced the reporters. Flashbulbs popped, microphones pointed toward him. He raised a hand, his voice steady and unshaken. "This wasn't just misconduct. It was a hate crime, and it ends today." A collective gasp followed, journalists erupting into a storm of questions, but Marcus said no more. He turned and walked back toward the aircraft, passing Boyd as the disgraced pilot was led down a separate stairwell through a side door. Boyd was still muttering angrily, the sound of his words drowned beneath the roar of a nearby engine starting up. Inside the terminal, passengers from the flight had begun to deboard, many pausing as they watched Boyd being led away. A few looked toward Malik, who was now being wheeled past the arrival gate. Though his face was pale, his eyes remained alert. The world had changed for him in the past few hours. He had been mocked, glued to a table, and stripped of dignity. But now, in the presence of flashing lights and pointed microphones, he was being seen. David walked beside the stretcher, holding his son's hand tightly, shielding him from the noise as best he could. Behind them, Marcus followed, silently coordinating with agents. Though he showed no sign of fatigue, his mind raced through the next steps: chain of evidence, media fallout, and ensuring Malik's story was protected. The air inside the terminal had grown tense, as though everyone knew something massive had just shifted. News anchors prepared their first wave of reports. Lawyers whispered into phones. And somewhere behind a pane of glass, a senior executive from Northern Vane Air watched in horror as the narrative began to spin out of their control. Boyd was gone, but the storm had just begun. Malik, still strapped to the stretcher, turned his head slowly. For a moment, his gaze landed on the reflection of himself in a passing window, bandaged, pale, but upright. A quiet strength rested in his eyes. He had not screamed. He had not lashed out. He had remembered, endured, and survived. And soon his face, innocent, worn, determined, would be everywhere. He boarded the plane as a quiet boy, but now he was about to become the face of something much louder. The footage hit the internet like a lightning strike. By nightfall, the video had spread across every major social platform, from news sites to student blogs. There was no music, no editing, just the raw, gut-wrenching images of Captain Boyd Rennick pressing an 11-year-old black boy's hand onto a tray table with industrial glue and mocking him as he cried. His voice could be heard faintly through the roar of the cabin. "Let's make sure you don't float away," followed by laughter and then a muttered remark. "Spoiled brats like you think the world owes you everything." Viewers didn't just see the act, they heard it, they felt it, and they reacted with fury. Within hours, hashtags began to trend. Number Justice for Malik, number Ground Boyd, number Not Just Turbulence. Pilots, teachers, civil rights advocates, and even veteran airline captains publicly condemned the act. Some posted videos in uniform stating their disgust. One clip from a senior black pilot named Henry Knox went viral. This was not a prank. This was not stress. This was hate in uniform. Northern Vane Air scrambled. At 9:47 p.m., they released a cold, clinical statement calling the incident deeply regrettable and confirming Boyd's indefinite suspension pending investigation. But the world had already made up its mind. The video didn't just show misconduct, it showed cruelty wrapped in command, racism masked as humor, and silence from those who should have acted sooner. Back at Caraway Medical Center, Malik lay quietly under thin white sheets, his blistered hand wrapped in soft gauze. The burns had already begun to bubble at the edges, and the nurse warned of possible scarring. Still, Malik didn't complain. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, his other hand clutched tight around the edge of his father's jacket. David Harper sat beside him, phone buzzing nonstop in his lap. Journalists, advocates, school administrators, even airline representatives had begun reaching out. But David ignored them all for now. His son's silence spoke louder than any interview ever could. "I'm sorry, buddy," David said softly, brushing hair from Malik's forehead. "I should have never let you go alone." Malik didn't answer right away. His face was pale, his lips dry, but his eyes, the same eyes that had once scanned comic books and sketch pads with joy, were sharp and focused. "I remembered everything," Malik whispered. David leaned in. "What do you mean?" "The jokes, the faces, even the seat numbers, where everyone sat, who laughed, who didn't," Malik said slowly. "I was scared, but I didn't forget." In the corner of the room, Agent Marcus Vell stood with arms crossed, watching in quiet admiration. He had heard every word. "You've got a strong mind, kid," Marcus said, stepping closer. His voice was steady, but something in his expression betrayed emotion. "Most grown men don't hold on like that. You're going to help more people than you know." Malik looked at him, blinking. "How?" Because the world's watching now, Marcus replied, and the truth, it's yours to tell. David turned to Marcus, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you think they'll charge him? Marcus nodded. I filed the report already. Charges are being drafted. Child endangerment, civil rights violations, abuse of authority. And I attached the cockpit audio, flight logs, crew reports. It's more than a case, it's a pattern. A deep silence filled the room. Outside, reporters gathered beyond the hospital entrance. Cameramen adjusted their tripods. Producers whispered into headsets. Malik's name was no longer just trending, it was symbolic. But inside the room, none of that mattered as much as the next breath, the next word. I don't want to be famous, Malik said after a while, looking at his wrapped hand. I just wanted to visit Uncle Greg. I just wanted to draw. David swallowed hard. And you still can. But now, people are listening. Maybe it's not what you asked for, but it's what we've been needing. The TV mounted in the hospital room played muted news clips, angles of the plane, stills of Boyd being escorted out in handcuffs, analysis from legal experts predicting the case would redefine airline accountability. Somewhere in the background, Malik's drawing sat folded at the foot of his bed, untouched since the flight. Marcus stepped to the window, glancing down at the growing crowd. They're calling for change now, but that change needs a face, a story. He turned and looked at Malik. You remember, you're strong. That makes you the story they'll follow. For the first time since landing, Malik sat up straighter. His hand throbbed, his chest ached, but his eyes didn't flinch. Outside, the world debated justice. Inside, a boy was deciding what kind of voice he wanted to have. The boy who once sat alone at 8C was now sitting at the center of a movement he never asked for, but one only he could lead. The private jet touched down at Grellman's secure terminal just as dawn broke across the skyline. Gray clouds hung low, casting long shadows over the tarmac. As the plane taxied to a stop, Malik Harper stared out the window, his bandaged hand resting quietly in his lap. His father, David, sat beside him in solemn silence, a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. They didn't speak. The weight of what was ahead filled the cabin like pressure before a storm. 2 agents in Navy suits waited at the bottom of the steps, one holding a clipboard, the other wearing a small badge with the National Transport Hearing Bureau seal. Mr. Harper, this way, please, one of them said. His voice was calm, but his eyes quickly scanned Malik's hand, then his face, as if memorizing it for what lay ahead. Inside the hearing center, the atmosphere was sterile but tense. Fluorescent lights hummed above marble floors, and the sound of echoing footsteps bounced between high ceilings and polished walls. David and Malik were led down a corridor lined with framed photographs of past transport reformers. At the end of the hall was a modest room guarded by a wooden door bearing a brass nameplate, Private Review Chamber B. Inside, a group of 7 board members sat around a long oval table. They were all men, older, clean-cut, some in suits, others in official bureau uniforms. One had a notepad filled with scribbles. Another already had a file open labeled Harper, Malik, Incident Report. Their faces were serious, expectant. David guided Malik to a leather chair across from the board. One of the members, a tall man with silver hair and sharp cheekbones, leaned forward. Malik, thank you for coming. You don't have to say anything today, but we would like to see the drawings you brought. His voice was steady, respectful. Malik hesitated, then quietly opened the flap of his blue backpack. He pulled out 3 sheets of paper, each neatly folded but creased from being clutched too tightly. The first drawing was of Boyd Rennick, exaggerated with sharp teeth, angry eyebrows, and a captain's hat twisted like horns. The second was of Malik himself, seated in 8C, his hand glued to the tray, tears trailing down his cheeks. But what stood out were his eyes, drawn wide open, alert, unwavering. The room fell still. One of the board members cleared his throat but said nothing. Another gently took the pages and passed them around. David sat upright, watching every face as they processed the images. His own hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white. Malik looked at the table, unable to meet their eyes. But the room didn't see weakness. They saw testimony, a child's truth sketched in pencil and pain. A knock broke the silence. The door opened and Marcus Bell entered, his steps purposeful but quiet. He wore his dark gray agency suit, his ID badge clipped neatly to his chest. He nodded to Malik and David, then addressed the board. "Thank you for allowing this review," he began. "I won't take long." His tone was professional but edged with urgency. "You've seen the incident footage, you've read the statements. What I want to add today isn't just about Boyd Rennick's actions, but about the pattern behind them." He placed a thick folder on the table. Inside were transcripts, emails, redacted testimonies, documents linking Boyd to 5 previous complaints over the past 6 years. Most had come from passengers of color, most had been quietly dismissed or settled under legal pressure from Northern Vein Air's internal team. "This isn't about one bad flight," Marcus continued. "It's about an unchecked culture. One where pilots like Rennick were protected, where patterns were buried under bureaucracy, and where passengers like Malik were seen as disposable." One of the board members, an older man with tired eyes, leaned back in his chair. "Are you saying Northern Vein knew?" Marcus didn't blink. "I'm saying they chose not to know, and now they don't have that choice anymore." For a moment, no one moved. The board sifted through the folder slowly, flipping from case to case. One man shook his head. Another whispered something to his neighbor. Malik sat quietly, his sketchpad back in his lap. He looked up at Marcus, then at the board. He wasn't afraid. He didn't feel small anymore. After what felt like hours, but had only been minutes, the silver-haired board member closed the folder and turned to the others. A nod passed around the table. "The board finds the conduct of Captain Boyd Rennick to be in direct violation of federal transport codes regarding safety, discrimination, and abuse of authority," he said formally. "Effective immediately, his pilot's license is revoked permanently." He looked at Marcus. "And we are authorizing a full-scale audit into Northern Vein Air's complaint management and pilot training programs." David let out a quiet breath. Malik's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't smile. Not yet. He just listened. One of the men added, "We'll need further cooperation from your office, Agent Bell, and possibly testimony from the other passengers." Marcus nodded. "You'll have it." The meeting adjourned quietly. The board members stood, some walking over to Malik to shake his hand gently. One of them, balding, with a soft voice, said, "Your drawings, they said everything." Outside, as David and Malik walked back through the corridor, sunlight now poured through the tall windows. The framed portraits on the wall seemed to stand a little taller. The hallway felt less cold. Malik looked up at his father. "Did I do okay?" David nodded, swallowing emotion. "You did more than okay." Behind them, Marcus stayed back to submit his documentation. As he handed off files to a clerk, he paused, glanced down the hallway, and watched the boy's figure disappear beyond the lobby doors. A quiet pride settled in his chest. One captain lost his wings, but the company that gave him cover was about to lose its shield too. The moment the envelope was handed to David Harper, he knew it wasn't just another sympathy letter. The gold trim and city seal pressed into the paper made his fingers pause before tearing it open. Inside, a single page carried the invitation, an official recognition ceremony hosted by the mayor of Caraway, honoring Malik for extraordinary courage under abuse. It would be live-streamed across the state, attended by community leaders, civil rights activists, educators, and dozens of press outlets. David read it twice before glancing at his son, who sat on the hospital bed quietly sketching in the light of a window. When he told Malik about the event, the boy looked up slowly, blinking as if trying to make sense of the words. "Why?" he asked, pencil resting between his fingers. "I didn't do anything special. I just sat there." David crouched down beside the bed, his voice gentle but firm. "You stayed calm. You remembered everything. You told the truth when it mattered. That takes courage, Malik. People need to see that." Malik didn't respond immediately. He returned to his sketchpad, shading a cape around a faceless hero, the edges rippling in the wind. His small voice eventually broke the silence. "I just want my hand to stop hurting. I don't want to be on TV." "I know," David said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "But sometimes, when something bad happens and you speak up, it helps make sure it doesn't happen again. Not just for you, for everyone." The day of the event arrived under a pale morning sky, the kind that made the city feel quiet even as traffic moved steadily outside the Caraway Civic Hall. A velvet carpet lined the building's wide entrance. Photographers, newscasters, and city officials gathered beneath white tents near the steps, their chatter filled with anticipation. Inside, the stage was set with 2 podiums, a row of flags, and an oversized city seal projected on a tall screen behind them. Every chair in the auditorium had been filled. Backstage, Malik adjusted the collar of his navy blazer for the third time. It itched a little, and the wrap still covering parts of his palm made buttoning his cuff difficult. David stood behind him, straightening his own tie and trying to hide his nervousness. "You look good," David said. "Strong." "I feel weird," Malik mumbled, shifting in his polished shoes. Before David could reply, a staff member with a clipboard signaled them toward the side curtain. The mayor was already at the podium, introducing Malik with carefully chosen words about bravery, resilience, and the importance of speaking truth to power. The applause began before Malik even stepped into the light. It grew louder as he appeared beside his father, walking carefully to center stage. The mayor, a tall, middle-aged man with sharp glasses and a rehearsed smile, extended his hand to Malik and gestured for him to stand beside the mic. Cameras flashed, people leaned forward in their seats. David rested a steadying hand on his son's back. "Malik Harper," the mayor began, voice echoing across the hall, "stood alone on a flight when no one else would speak. Today, he stands for something much greater. Courage, integrity, justice. On behalf of the city of Caraway, we thank you." More applause. Malik blinked at the lights. His throat felt tight, but he stepped forward slowly. The mic was taller than he expected, and he stood on his toes to speak. His voice, soft but unshaking, carried just enough to reach the room. "I didn't ask to be brave," Malik said, glancing briefly at the crowd, then back down at his bandaged hand. "I just didn't want anyone else to get stuck." Silence followed. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from confusion. It was the kind that falls when something honest lands in the middle of a room and no one wants to be the first to move. The mayor nodded solemnly. A man in the front row lowered his camera. Somewhere in the back, a reporter stopped scribbling and looked up, still. The moment passed like the slow crest of a wave. Then came the applause, this time not explosive, but heartfelt, deliberate, the kind that rises not from celebration, but from understanding. Backstage, as David guided Malik off the stage, a television screen in the media tent replayed the boy's words. Inside the corporate boardroom of Northern Vane's downtown headquarters, the same footage streamed in silence. Executives sat with arms crossed, faces grim, watching the small figure in the blazer say so little, yet somehow too much. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The storm was already coming. The lawsuits, the resignations, the audits. They could feel it in the silence between Malik's words and the echo that followed. The boy's words didn't shout, but they echoed in every hallway where silence once ruled. The courtroom lights buzzed faintly overhead as a hush fell across the packed chamber. The air was thick with anticipation. The doors had just closed behind a line of attorneys carrying file boxes marked with evidence labels, photos, testimonies, depositions, and at the heart of it all stood the name that had stirred a nation, Malik Harper. What began as a silent humiliation had transformed into the loudest reckoning Northern Vane air had ever faced. Lawsuits had been filed rapidly, first by individual passengers who claimed to have suffered racial insults or emotional distress from Boyd Rennick and others like him. Then came the class action, over 24 plaintiffs represented by the Newfield Justice Alliance, a nonprofit legal center with a reputation for taking on powerful corporations. The lead counsel, a tall, sharp-eyed man named Arlen Price, addressed the press calmly that morning. "This is not a witch hunt," he said. "This is accountability delayed for far too long." Inside the Harper family's modest suite at Caraway's downtown legal residence, David Harper stared out the window, watching journalists gather outside. Malik, still recovering, was sketching quietly on the edge of the bed, headphones on, drawing a picture of a large-scale tipping, on one side a jetliner, and on the other a small hand holding a pencil. David turned to Marcus Vell, who stood beside a table covered in documents. "I need them to feel this," David said, his voice low and steady. "Not just Boyd, all of them. Every executive who buried a report, every flight supervisor who told someone to let it go." Marcus nodded. He had just completed a full deposition, linking Boyd's actions to 5 other incidents, each involving passengers of color, each quietly settled or dismissed. One man had been called a security risk for speaking Swahili on a call. Another had been moved to the back despite paying for business class. 2 others had written complaints that never received responses. And one, an elderly veteran, had been denied water during a delay, then escorted off the plane when he protested. Every story echoed with a similar pattern: racial bias dressed up as policy. "I've seen enough," Marcus said, placing his hand on a thick folder of internal emails. "There's no more room for denial." The pressure on Northern Vein Air mounted quickly. Stocks dipped after the class action was announced. A group of pilots released an anonymous letter condemning Boyd's actions and calling for reforms. Families began boycotting the airline. And, amid it all, a confidential offer was quietly slipped across the table: a settlement proposal for the Harper family. David opened the envelope with Marcus beside him. It was generous, financially. A 7-figure payout, private school tuition for Malik, even a public apology drafted and ready to publish. But the final page made David freeze. "In accepting this settlement," it read, "the Harper family agrees not to pursue or support any further public litigation or reform initiatives concerning Northern Vein Air or its personnel." He closed the file slowly. "They want our silence," he murmured. Marcus gave him a long look. "You don't owe anyone a fight, David. You've already done more than most ever could." David met his eyes, voice firmer now. "I owe my son the kind of world he deserves, and I'm not selling that for a check." That evening, David stood in front of the cameras, flanked by attorneys and Marcus. With calm resolve, he addressed the crowd. "We reject Northern Vein's settlement," he announced. "Instead, we demand reforms. Real ones. We want body cameras on all flight staff. We want passengers to report discrimination anonymously. We want mandatory anti-bias training, not once, but annually. And we want all crew complaints reviewed by an external oversight body." Reporters fired off questions. Was this legally possible? Would the airline comply? David's reply was steady. "They will, if they want to fly with trust again." Inside Northern Vein's high-rise headquarters, panic was setting in. Their PR chief scrambled to control the narrative. The board called an emergency session. They'd never faced this level of coordinated backlash, especially not one led by a single father and his son. But the optics were against them. The video footage, the public outrage, the refusal of hush money. And behind it all, the unwavering presence of Marcus Vell, whose federal credibility turned this into more than just a PR crisis. It was now a regulatory threat. Weeks passed. Legal meetings blurred into public panels, and protesters began appearing at airports with signs reading, 8C, we see you. The tide was no longer in Northern Vein's control. At last, they cracked. A press release was issued late at night, quiet but groundbreaking. Northern Vein Air agreed to fund and support a new independent oversight council. It would monitor crew conduct, audit complaints, and enforce disciplinary action beyond the company's reach. And on the charter, bold and final, was the name of the boy whose hand once couldn't move, but whose voice now moved an entire industry. Malik Harper. A company once known for silence would now be forced to listen, and the boy they tried to humiliate would be the reason. The classroom fell silent when Malik stepped through the doorway. It was his first day back since the incident, and though the school counselor had spoken to each class about treating him gently, nothing could prepare him for the eyes that followed him, curious, hesitant, and wide with unspoken questions. Malik clutched his backpack tighter, the strap pressing against his healing hand wrapped in a light bandage. He kept his head down, ignoring the whispers that drifted behind him like smoke. "Hey, that's the kid from the news," someone murmured. Malik walked to his desk, third row from the front, and slid into his seat quietly. Mr. Langston, his homeroom teacher, cleared his throat and forced a smile. "Class, let's welcome Malik back. We're glad you're here." A scattered round of claps followed, some genuine, others awkward. Malik nodded politely but said nothing. He didn't feel back. He felt like someone else entirely, like a shadow sitting in his own seat. Throughout the day, classmates found excuses to inch closer. A boy named Jalen leaned over during math and slid a folded paper toward him. Malik unfolded it carefully. A crude drawing of a plane, with a stick figure in the window and the words, "You're a hero," scrawled underneath. Malik stared at it, unsure how to feel. Another student, Casey, quietly offered his pencil when Malik's broke, whispering, "That was really brave, what you did." But Malik didn't feel brave. The glue, the sting, the heat of Boyd's words, they hadn't left him. Not really. In the cafeteria, Malik sat at the far end of a long table, away from the usual noise. His appetite had shrunk since the incident, and even the smell of spaghetti and garlic bread made his stomach turn. He picked at his food, lost in memory. Every time a tray clinked or a chair scraped too fast, his heart jumped. Sometimes he caught himself staring at his own hand, flexing the fingers slowly, as if checking whether they still worked the same. When he got home that afternoon, David Harper was already waiting with hot cocoa and a new sketchbook. Malik sat quietly on the couch, unzipping his backpack with tired hands. He hadn't said much about his day, but David could read the silence. "Rough one?" he asked gently. Malik nodded. "They all think I'm a superhero or something." David sat beside him, his own posture slightly tense. "Well, you were strong. That doesn't mean you have to feel strong every minute." There was a pause. Then Malik asked, "Do you think Agent Marcus was always supposed to be there?" "On that flight?" David hesitated. "Maybe. Or maybe someone just knew you'd need help and sent the right person." Later that evening, while David washed dishes in the kitchen, Malik sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sketchbook in his lap. He drew quietly, his pencil gliding across the page with slow, steady strokes. First, a plane, peacefully cruising above a sea of clouds. Then, in the back row, a small figure in a gray hoodie, head tilted slightly, eyes calm. And on the chest, a faint glow. A badge, barely visible but shining all the same. He shaded the windows gently, making the cabin warm and safe, not like the one he remembered. His fingers moved with careful detail, capturing the texture of the hoodie, the curve of the badge, the line of the plane's tail. He didn't rush. When he finished, he tore the page out neatly and carried it to his father, who was drying a plate at the sink. "Dad," Malik said softly. David turned, his eyes tired but warm. "Yeah, bud." Malik handed him the drawing. "That's Agent Marcus. He flew with me. I didn't know it then, but I think someone sent him." David took the sketch and, for a moment, said nothing. He traced a thumb across the pencil lines, then looked up, blinking fast. "Maybe someone did," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. Together, they walked to the living room wall. David pulled a pin from the corkboard and placed the drawing dead center, smoothing the edges flat. It stood alone among grocery lists and school flyers, its pencil lines gentle but proud. They stepped back and looked at it for a while. It wasn't just a picture, it was a quiet thank you to the stranger who stood up when no one else did. The sound of the unveiling drew quiet applause as Malik Harper stood before the gleaming bronze plaque inside the National Flight Ethics Center in Grelmont. Cameras flashed and journalists whispered to each other, but Malik barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the words carved into the metal, each letter clear, bold, and deliberate. Malik Harper Passenger Advocacy Wing, founded in honor of courage, dignity, and truth. He stood tall, his posture composed, though his fingers still trembled slightly at his sides. He wore a charcoal gray suit and navy tie, the collar neatly pressed, a quiet contrast to the storm he had once survived. The palm of his right hand, though healed, still carried a faint scar, a soft, raised pattern that no one else could see from where they stood. But Malik felt it with every heartbeat. A man stepped forward, Director Elton Graves of the Ethics Center. His voice carried throughout the marble hall. "This dedication marks more than the end of a case. It marks the beginning of a safer, fairer future in aviation. Because of one young man's quiet strength, the skies are no longer a place where silence protects injustice." Malik gave a small nod as the crowd applauded again, the sound echoing off the tall glass walls. The air smelled faintly of polished stone and fresh paper, and though the morning sun beamed through the skylights, Malik felt a chill rise from within. It wasn't nerves, it was memory. He looked around, catching sight of his father standing quietly in the back, dressed in his veteran's coat, arms crossed but expression proud. David Harper didn't speak, didn't wave, but his gaze held firm. It was a gaze that said, "You did it," without needing to say anything at all. Malik's breath hitched just slightly. His mind wandered back, not to the day of the incident, but to the long months afterward. The courtroom sketches, the physical therapy, the nightmares. He had learned that healing was not a finish line. It was a choice you made each morning. Now, a year later, the world was different. Northern Vein Air had undergone sweeping changes. A new CEO, a compliance board, and, most important of all, new laws that made racial misconduct in aviation a federal-level offense. The man who started it all, Boyd Rennick, had pled guilty without trial. His mugshot a stark reminder of how high someone could fall when they thought power made them untouchable. But Malik's mind wasn't on Boyd anymore. As the ceremony ended, a few officials stepped forward to offer handshakes, photo ops, and warm words of praise. Malik obliged, polite but distant. He wasn't here to be celebrated, he was here to honor the journey. Still, one handshake made him pause. "Mr. Harper," said a tall man in a crisp black suit, "my name is Director Cade Walker, Department of Passenger Rights Enforcement. We're using your case as a foundational model. What you did, it gave structure to something we've struggled with for years." Malik looked up. "I didn't really do anything," he said quietly. "I just didn't want anyone else to get hurt like that." Walker nodded with a gravity that suggested he understood more than he let on. And that's why it mattered. Later that afternoon, away from the press and the polished speeches, Malik sat in a quiet office with his sketchpad open across his lap. His father stood nearby, speaking with one of the center's coordinators. Malik, pen in hand, worked slowly, methodically, every stroke deliberate. On the page, a plane arched through soft clouds. Inside the cockpit, he drew a figure, hoodie up, head turned slightly, hand on the controls. A single speech bubble floated above the windshield. In it, simple words formed, "Everyone on board matters." He signed it quietly at the bottom, then slipped it into a folder. "It's for Agent Marcus," he said as his father rejoined him. David looked down at the drawing, his expression softening. "You think he'll like it?" Malik nodded once. "I think he'll hang it up." And he was right. That evening, thousands of miles away, Agent Marcus Vell sat behind a desk in a windowless operations room. The picture arrived by private courier. He opened it carefully, studied the details, the lines, the colors, the message, and stood in silence for a long moment before reaching for a simple black frame. Without ceremony, he placed the sketch inside and hung it directly above his desk. He said nothing, but he didn't need to. Across the country, parents told their children a new kind of bedtime story, not one of superheroes or fantasy, but of a real boy, a quiet artist who once sat alone in seat 8C and endured something no child should, and then turned that pain into change. He boarded as a child, but landed as a quiet force no one could ignore. They tried to treat him like a toy until the FBI showed up. If you believe every black child deserves safety, respect, and justice, subscribe now. This isn't just a story, it's a stand. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It was created to highlight the disturbing realities of racism, abuse of authority, and the dehumanization often faced by marginalized communities. This narrative is intended to raise awareness, provoke critical thought, and inspire action toward justice, accountability, and human dignity for all.